causation with a human face. So you are all invited. These last 3 events are all in person, but they will also be streamed on Zoom. So if you want to join us online, please go to the center's website and register to get a Zoom invitation. All right. Today, it's my really great pleasure to welcome back, in some form of back, Alison Fernandes, who was a postdoctoral fellow at the center a few years ago, and which was a really wonderful year to have her with us. And she's now assistant professor in philosophy at Trinity College Dublin. She works in a range of areas in philosophy of science and metaphysics, with a focus on the foundations of physics and also agency. She has published very widely in the best journals, as one might say, even in psychology. There's a recent paper in cognitive science, which I really enjoyed. But also, what I really wanted to flag is, and what you should be waiting for in the coming weeks, maybe months, if the process is a bit too slow, is our forthcoming book, which is the Temporal Asymmetry of Causation. We're really looking forward to read that. It's going to be published by Cambridge University Press, the Elements in the Philosophy of Physics series. And I really wanted to flag this book, mostly because if it's like the other, well, for many reasons, but one of them is that if it's like the other elements, it should be free for 2 weeks, and you can download it for 2 weeks. So it's a great opportunity, actually, to get really excellent books. And I'm really looking forward to be the first one to download that book as soon as it hits a CUP website. Alison, the floor is yours now, and really welcome back. It's wonderful to have you at least online, and hopefully in the coming years in person at the center.
That would be lovely. And look, thank you for the beautiful introduction. I really, I have joyful memories of the center, so it is very nice to be back in some sense. Okay, so I'm going to be now sharing my screen and hoping this works. Okay. Okay, so what I'm presenting today is very much work in progress, and it's very methodological. But it is stuff that I've been thinking about for a while, and even stuff that I'd begun when I was at the center. So I'm very keen for feedback. But, as is the nature of work in progress and early work, I'm sure there are some things I need to be pushed on, and I'm very welcome to suggestions for how to take this further. So the main aim today is to argue for a kind of naturalist approach to doing the metaphysics of science, and one in which it turns out thinking about agency is going to be relevant for thinking about even the metaphysics of relatively fundamental physics. So the main aim is methodological, to talk about this method, but I will talk about how it might apply in particular debates, particularly concerning time and temporal asymmetries, and also what I'm calling scientific modal relations, so things like laws and causation. But there are a number of subsidiary aims which might be just as interesting to you. One is that I do want to argue there is an interesting project of doing the metaphysics of science that may take us beyond the interests of science. Secondly, I'm going to be suggesting that there are interesting explanatory demands that can be asked of any theory in science, even though they're not necessarily things that a particular science might be paying attention to. And finally, I am going to be using along the way a kind of functional and compositional unity among the sciences. So I think that part of this metaphysical project is going to require, some of the sciences to relate in certain ways, which I'll talk about. I'm hoping this is not too controversial, but again, feedback on all of this is very welcome. So the plan, I'm going to start by talking about, what this metaphysics of science is going to be like, why we might do it. Second, the motivation for doing it in a naturalistic way, in a way that makes use of science along the way. And the third section, I'm going to sort of put those together and talk more concretely about how doing metaphysics using this naturalistic method will work. I'll focus particularly in the fourth section on how considerations of agency are going to come up and why we should be thinking about the function of scientific entities when answering metaphysical questions. And then finally, hoping there's time, I'll talk also about how it's going to apply in the case of modality and modal relations, because I think that's a particularly underexplored area, at least taking this kind of approach. Okay, so metaphysics of science. The idea with metaphysics of science, I take it, is we're going to be answering questions like the following. We're going to be asking, what is there? What is it like? Why are these things like this? And how do things of different kinds relate to one another? And I mean things here very loosely, not sort of necessarily objects located in space and time or anything like that. But if we're doing the metaphysics of science, the kinds of things we're talking about here are going to be the kinds of things investigated by the sciences. Now, sometimes people use the word metaphysics in other senses, and that's fine. I'm not worried about terminology, but the sort of minimal kind of metaphysics I have in mind here is not committed to there being some kind of methodology that's different from that of the sciences, nor is it necessarily committed to there being essences or natures of things, or to a kind of metaphysical fundamentality that is sort of a kind of dependence, not investigated by the sciences. And for those last categories, it might turn out that essences and natures are things we should talk about, but the method of metaphysics is not committed to that. It doesn't have to be that we discover essences and natures in order to do metaphysics. So to give a quick example, with respect to causation, we might ask questions like, are there causal relations? What are they like? Are they always temporally directed at our world? Why are they temporally directed at our world? Please see forthcoming book, or soon to be forthcoming, hopefully. We also might ask, how do causal relations relate to probabilities? Other things we might have in our ontology. But we don't necessarily have to ask questions like, but what are causal relations? Or is it part of the nature of causal relations temporally directed at our world? These questions seem to get at the sort of deep underlying nature of causation. Nor do we have to necessarily ask whether causal relations are more fundamental than probabilities or counterfactuals. Maybe at best we can just relate them to one another. So I want to suggest that there is room for doing a metaphysics of science of this kind that goes beyond what you might call the explicit interests of science and scientists, operating in their usual domains. Not to say that metaphysics is always going to be useless, of course, and sometimes answering metaphysical questions is going to at least be potentially useful for scientific investigation, but we also might just pursue this kind of metaphysics for other reasons. So we might be interested in evaluating to what extent our scientific theories agree with our ordinary view of the world, evaluating the implications of scientific theories for philosophical theories, or generating broader claims about the world beyond those that particular sciences are interested in making. So these are reasons why we might be doing this kind of metaphysics of science, even if it's not helping a particular science in its immediate endeavors. All right, so that's very briefly the kind of metaphysics I'm doing here. What is it to do it naturalistically? So people have often distinguished between different kinds of naturalism. One big division is between a sort of ontological naturalism, which says that what exists is the things that science says exists, and a methodological naturalism, which I'm saying is an attitude that we should adopt the methods of science when doing philosophy. And here I'm going to be particularly adopting methodological naturalism. Why? Because ontological naturalism has tended to suggest there's some kind of standpoint from outside of science by which we can evaluate whether we should be agreeing with the existence of claims of science, whereas methodological naturalism rather just suggests we just keep doing science. We are working from within, as it were. And nor is methodological naturalism committed to some claims about why we should adopt scientific method or exactly what scientific method is like. Again, it's not trying to stand outside of scientific method, it just wants to keep doing science, even when doing philosophy. Now, I'm not going to defend naturalism to core across all of philosophy. There are going to be some areas where it's going to be more controversial to apply, but I am going to suggest now that it's at least a very good default starting place when our subject matter explicitly are those things investigated by the sciences, which is what I'm taking metaphysics of science to be about. So here we are, we're now adopting methodological naturalism when doing the metaphysics of science. And again, I'm not worried about how we use the terminology, but just for the day for this talk, this kind of methodological naturalism is stronger than a lot of positions labeled as naturalist within discussions of metaphysics of science. So in particular, this isn't just metaphysics informed by science or metaphysics that sort of takes off with its methodology once scientific method has kind of stopped. The idea is we keep on doing science all the way. There's no point where we are merely just being informed by science. We are just using scientific method, over and over. So putting those pieces together, what's going to happen when we do metaphysics in this naturalistic way? Now, plenty of naturalistic metaphysics will actually just take place within ordinary scientific investigation or very closely allied with it. You can ask questions about what chemical bonds are like and how they relate to other things. And, these are questions about what things there are and what they're like, and they can be investigated in a naturalistic way. There are also many cases where we have investigations that don't necessarily take place within ordinary science, as in they're not necessarily published in scientific journals, but still seem to be pretty continuous with particular sciences, perhaps using some conceptual help from philosophy, but is still, answering to the concerns of particular sciences. So if I ask whether electrons are waves or particles, or what is it for a trait to be natural, this investigation might involve philosophers and scientists collaborating, but there's a very kind of clear sense in which we're directly aiding a particular science in these endeavors. But there are also going to be cases which don't fit naturally within a particular area of science, and that don't necessarily aid a particular domain of science in its immediate aims. They might, but just not necessarily. And this is going to include topics that I think are just too general to be encompassed by a single domain, and causation, I think, is going to count as one of these. And also topics where, what might be called our pre-theoretic intuitions play some kind of disputed role, and where there's a lot of back and forth about whether those intuitions should be given any kind of evidentiary role. And so we start to think about, what are the actual origins or sources of these intuitions, and we start finding ourselves doing some psychology, even though the initial topics we were investigating might have been in physics or biology or elsewhere. And my suggestion is, when you have these things going on, either very general topics or topics that seem to cross domains in surprising ways that we're not accustomed to, philosophy is more likely to have a more significant role to play. And we're going to find, decent questions to ask in the metaphysics of science that are not likely to be addressed, within a particular scientific domain by itself. So, thinking that we're working within this kind of area, an area which isn't necessarily going to aid a particular science in its immediate aims, but is nevertheless, a sensible thing to do. I'm going to suggest at this point that we can introduce certain explanatory demands, which any theory must meet. And if you're a naturalist, there's going to be certain limits on how you answer these kinds of demands. And while these demands are going to seem in a certain sense relatively weak, they're not going to settle a lot of questions, what they lack in strength, they make up for in generality. They are things we can ask of basically any theory you put forward in science or metaphysics. I'm going to suggest also they still place substantive, interesting restrictions on theories, and they're particularly relevant when the theories are in fact those of metaphysics. So this is going to be our useful way of doing metaphysics of science naturalistically in a way that has quite general scope. So the first set of demands are epistemic demands. And this is a thought that, given our theories, we should explain naturalistically how we come to know the things that the theory posits. One thing that's going to imply is that the theory doesn't undermine its own evidential basis. That is, you don't think that if the theory were true, you would have no reason for believing it were true. This is something that happens with Boltzmann brains. I'll talk more about these requirements later, but essentially here, you don't want your theory of the world to undermine your ability to know that it's true. That would look bad. And more positively, you should be able to give some account of how you come to know the theory is in fact true, if the theory is true. Secondly, there are what I'm calling intentional appearance demands. I would love a better label for these. Here, we want to be able to explain naturalistically how we come to have certain experiences and intuitions. that are often the starting point of investigation. And thirdly, there's what I'm calling conceptual demands, and these are about being able to explain naturalistically how we come to have the relevant concepts and reason in the way that the theory, itself employs. And the idea is these are explanatory demands which you can ask very generally for lots of different kinds of theories. To sort of help us get more of a grip on what's going on with them, some of these might be thought of in terms of coherency. So with the epistemic demands, what we're aiming for is a certain kind of coherency where if the theory is true, we still have a story of how we came to know that it's true. And again, this isn't going to be the only criteria we use in theory choice, of course, but it does look bad if a theory can't meet this aim. Secondly, with the intentional appearance demands, these are primarily, I would say, about what I'm calling recovering one starting point. So given that you started your investigation perhaps with some intuitions or experiences, your theory at the end that you come to should be able to explain why you came to have these intuitions or experiences. Again, even if you're mistaken in what those intuitions or experiences were, something about what you had at the start has to be explainable by what you come to at the end of your scientific investigation. And the conceptual demands, I would actually suggest carry both these elements of coherency and recovering one starting point. So, a lot of investigations start with us having some concepts and may also end with the same concepts. Investigations about what causation is like often have that form. And here you want to be able to explain, how you have those concepts, both the ones you started with and the ones you come to at the end. And I will give some more examples of this. So if it's looking a bit hazy, don't worry yet. So with these kind of explanatory demands, just to be clear, it's bad if you don't have any answer to these explanatory demands using your theory and whatever other theories you want to add to it that are naturalistic. But it's particularly bad if you have reason to think these demands just can't be met, that even with better theories developed elsewhere, you couldn't actually have answers to these questions. But we're not going to have trouble, merely if our intuitions are all mistaken. That could be the case, and we could still meet all these explanatory demands. And I'm going to suggest also, taking this kind of approach, we may not even have answers to all the kind of metaphysical questions that we started out with. And I'm going to suggest that's okay. I can talk maybe about some quick examples in the Q&A, but there might be, theories which we haven't got no reasons to decide between, but where structure and ontology are somewhat different on those two theories. I'm going to suggest that might be okay, but mainly an aside there. So to give a quick example of how these explanatory demands work, I'm going to give a bit of a case study for thinking about the direction of time. So say we have a theory that posits a direction of time that is unrelated to the distribution of matter and unrelated to how other scientific relations are oriented. There are some proposals that look like they have a direction of time of this kind. Now, there seems to be a puzzle here in that such a direction of time, it doesn't seem, could be manifest to us. And people concerned with these kind of primitive directions of time, like Hugh Price, have often pushed this point. So the complaint is made that we couldn't explain naturalistically how we come to know this primitive direction of time, nor how it gave rise to our experiences of passage of time or the specialness of the present, say. And nor is it going to be even clear why we would have the concept of there being a primitive direction of time if this primitive direction of time just has no relevance for our lives. So put contrawise, if we are going to have a primitive direction of time, my goodness, it had better have some implications for things like the distribution of matter or other scientific relations if we're going to answer these kind of explanatory demands. Now, given the way the debate has gone, I think you can see these kind of explanatory demands are playing an increasing role. So early A theorists and A theories of views that have a primitive direction of time as well as a privileged special present. I'm going to suggest I didn't really consider these kind of demands at all. You just posited a metaphysical picture of time that seemed to match your intuitive view about the world. Then B theorists came along. They didn't have a special present, and they sometimes didn't have a primitive direction of time. And they started to think about how to answer these kinds of explanatory demands, often naturalistically. It was partly because they were giving up our intuitions and saying our intuitions are false, that they had to explain why we had perhaps these mistaken intuitions. Current A theorists, therefore, have sort of kind of taken on board the fact that these demands are in play, but they've often given non-naturalistic answers to them. So answers where metaphysical explanatory relations of a kind that you don't find in science do a lot of the heavy lifting. But you also, as the debate goes on, I think that, the ordinary A-B theory sides are sort of falling apart a bit. So you have what I'm calling quasi-A theorists. These are A theorists who have a primitive direction of time, but no special present. And they do start to answer the explanatory demands somewhat naturalistically, but arguably by revising what counts as science in this case and what counts as scientific method. So they are trying to do the thing naturalistically, but possibly by revising science too much. And then you have what I'm calling quasi-B theorists. And these theorists often answer these explanatory demands, but don't take their demands to settle the ontology. So they don't really sign up to being a B theorist in the standard sense, mainly because they're just interested in doing the explanatory demands independently of whether that settles the ontology. And that is, in a sense, the kind of attitude I'm often wanting to adopt as well. So, a background to this talk is sort of my interest in agency. And curiously, it turns out that, features of us turn out to play a role in answering all of these explanatory demands in a naturalistic way, at least. So the epistemic demands or the intentional appearance demands are thinking about our perceptual apparatus and how we come to know the world is a certain way. And with the conceptual demands, we're thinking about, the basis on which we form concepts. And as I sort of hinted at earlier, if we're going to be answering these explanatory demands naturalistically, we're going to often have to invoke investigations from psychology, even when doing, things like the direction of time, which seems to be mainly a project within physics. And so you do have, cross-disciplinary activity coming up here. And you also have, a reason for thinking that these kind of investigations won't necessarily take place within a particular science because they are so cross-disciplinary in this way. But you have, even at this point, agency featuring in doing the metaphysics of even relatively fundamental physics, where, questions about there being a direction of time are typically raised. So I want to suggest, though, up to this point, usually the epistemic and the intentional appearance demands get the most airplay. Typically debates in time are, they'll raise concerns about knowledge. That will be the way these demands are usually put. I think partly because we take our claims to knowledge quite seriously. And we also do have a sort of well-established program of doing naturalized epistemology and explaining naturalistically how we come to know the world is a certain way. The intentional appearance demands also get a fair bit of airplay, at least in the philosophy of time. And I think it's partly because we're used to intuitions being taken somewhat seriously within philosophy, and of the role of intuitions being debated. And again, you find, some concerns of this kind also raised within the debate about the metaphysics of time, about whether a B theorist can, say, recover why the world seems to us to have a primitive direction of time and a special present and things like this, even if it doesn't turn out to have those things. But arguably, I'm going to suggest the conceptual demands of being kind of, ought to come a bit more to the fore in these debates, and they're equally as important. And this requires to be able to explain naturalistically how we come to have the relevant concepts and reason in the terms that the theory uses. So we're now into the fourth section, thinking about how agency and function will feature in answering these conceptual demands. So when it comes to just in general addressing why we have certain concepts, you might adopt what I'm calling a descriptive flat-footism, where you just say, look, it's because those things exist. And I don't think that many people would sign up to that view explicitly, but it seems to happen in the background sort of implicitly in some of these debates, where people don't think there's any sort of important thing to say once you've got the things in there, about how we came to have the concepts for those things. There's also slightly up from that a view called metaphysical magnetism, or that I'm calling that, where you take it that things exist, but then also have some kind of metaphysical oomph to them that somehow help our concepts and brains latch on to concepts of those things. Often I think metaphysical fundamentality is being used to play that kind of explanatory role. But thirdly, we have what I'm calling naturalistic functionalism, and that's to think that we acquire concepts because reasoning using that given concept is useful to us. And I think that's primarily what's going on with people like Quine and Carnap and Hugh Price. Now, just to be clear, it's not always that our use of the given concept suggests that it's relevant and useful for us. It might be, adopting naturalism, the kind of functionalism part might be inappropriate in certain domains where we're radically mistaken, or where the concepts have other functions that are more important than the kind of descriptive and explanatory aims of science. But bracketing, going mistaken in these ways, in the good cases where all is going well and the concepts are primarily being used in science, naturalistic functionalism seems like the way to go. We reason in certain terms because doing so is useful to us. So again, we can see this kind of demand at work in direction of time and metaphysics of time debates if we look a little carefully. So I think early A theorists, didn't really consider these demands at all. And they're starting to get some airplay within current A theorists. But again, I think usually there is some kind of idea that if the primitive direction of time is metaphysically fundamental, we'll somehow sort of latch onto that in a kind of automatic way. Whereas it's normally B theorists and these quasi-B theorists who, even though they're not necessarily thinking in terms of function and concepts, do at least, give us the kind of resources we might need to naturalistically explain how we come to have concepts of, the present or the flow of time and so forth. And you see that, particularly in Craig Callender's recent book, this is particularly coming out there. So I think I can probably skip this. For the most part, sometimes a concept might not be directly useful to us, but can be somewhat indirectly useful to us. I'm not going to be talking about those kind of cases very much today, but I'm going to allow for that. And secondly, I haven't said what it is about us that is relevant for whether we acquire the concepts. In a lot of the debates I'm interested in, I think it's ourselves as agents and the features that make us agents that are particularly relevant for explaining why the concept is useful to us, but I won't be arguing for that more so today than by gesturing at some examples. Okay. Now, strangely, part of why I've been coming at this route from naturalism is that often when someone begins with functionalism and starts thinking about the function of our concepts, this is thought of as being just very inimical to the metaphysical project. And it seemed like a completely different interest that would just have no metaphysical implications. And you find this particularly in Hugh Price's Global Pragmatism and his work, where he's very interested in why we come to have the concepts we do, but takes this to have just no important metaphysical upshots. Also in certain interpretations of Carnap, you get a similar kind of thing coming out where if we're thinking about our concepts, we're not thinking about the things themselves and how how those things are relevant to us. We're just we're not answering metaphysical questions. We're just thinking about the usefulness of concepts. And I think this is just a mistake. If we are concerned with answering naturalistically why we have the concepts we do, typically the functionality of the concept is going to depend on the existence of the thing that it's pointing out, as well as the relevance of the thing itself for ourselves, typically as agents. And I think you find this nicely sort of brought out in Quine's work. The reason we develop a term like water is because water exists and it's relevant for our survival. And so thinking about how we come to have the concept water can be relevant for thinking about what the actual world is like. Okay. Now, Price is aware of this background, but he has some arguments for why he nevertheless thinks that a focus on concepts and why we come to have certain concepts is not going to lead us to, the things themselves and the metaphysics of those things. And the main reason for this is what he calls functional pluralism. So to take an example from ethics, say I notice people, are labeling certain things as good, and I wonder, what is this good ethical language about? It would be some kind of mistake, Price thinks, to automatically assume that there are good things in the world that would feature then naturalistically in explaining why we use that term good in the ways that we do. And the reason for this is that, the function of our talk of goodness, that is a function of ethics, might be very different from the function of science. And so when taking part in the scientific project of explaining why concepts are useful, we just can't help ourselves to ethical concepts who, aren't functionally unified with our scientific concepts. So functional pluralism is meant to sort of tell us we can't help ourselves to using, say, ethical concepts when giving scientific explanations of why we use ethical terms. This is some kind of mistake here. Now, curiously, this is maybe fine regarding ethics. The problem is that this kind of functional pluralism just doesn't get a grip when the concepts we're exploring are those indeed of the sciences. In these cases, we can assume that the concepts of the sciences are indeed functionally unified with the concepts of the sciences. There's no bad presumption there. And so we can start to, use causal relations and talk about causal relations in explaining, for example, why we come to talk in causal terms. And so our explanations of causal terms may have implications for what we want to say about the actual causal relations in the world. Now, Price might come back at this point, and I think, this is kind of a tacit argument we're having. What if the functional role of science is also disunified? What if there is functional pluralism within science? And I think that is partly what Price is thinking about here. So he thinks of causation as playing the role of allowing agents to express certain conditional dependencies in their beliefs. Typically beliefs regarding sort of what will happen conditional on an agent freely choosing or acting in a certain way. And again, this is from the agent's perspective. Whereas, fundamental physics for Price doesn't have that kind of role. So when Price does his accounts of causation and the role of causation, he doesn't think this has any relevance for something like thinking about how causation fits into a physical world. And you might think this point holds more generally. Maybe certain, in inverted commas, higher level sciences have different functional roles from lower level sciences. And so you can't sort of take yourself to learn about the sort of overall nature of the world, say, or the metaphysics from thinking about how we use concepts, because we're making some kind of functionalist mistake in thinking that they all serve the same function and can be talked about together. This is hazy because I don't think this argument is typically made explicit, but I think it's wrong. And two ways of seeing why it's wrong. Firstly, this response would only work if, when doing the naturalistic program of explaining why we use our concepts, I was somehow limited to only using, lower level science or something like that. But typically, when we're explaining naturalistically how we come to use certain concepts, we're using higher level sciences. We're using talk about evolution and causal explanation and agency. We are not just talking about, laws and generalizations in fundamental physics. So within this kind of project, there's no worries helping myself to causal relations when reasoning about why we reason in causal terms. I'm using the same kind of science in both cases. So there's no sort of worries there. But maybe that's just one case. What if we do genuinely say want to talk about the function of concepts within fundamental physics, but using talk about agency and causation? Is that going to be okay? I think that's okay too. And here is where I bring in my minimal kind of unity among the sciences. So I'm going to suggest there's a kind of what I'm calling functional and compositional unity among the sciences. So without having a kind of strong reduction where you can derive biology from fundamental physics, what I would like instead is some kind of compositional and derivational unity. So here I mean we have objects and we can talk about them using different sciences, partly because we think of these objects described in a higher level way are made up of certain quote unquote lower level objects composed and arranged in certain ways. And if I'm deriving the motions of this object, say a duck, using my different quote unquote levels of sciences, these derivations had better accord with one another reasonably well, or that domain needs revision or it's being inappropriately applied. Notice here, I'm not appealing to the fact that explanation works the same at all these levels, or that fundamental explanations are different, or that high level explanations are different. I'm just using straightforward derivations here. And the thought is there is this much derivational and compositional unity among the sciences. Good. Given that, you can ask, how things at different levels relate to one another. And that is all the unity of science we need in order to ask reasonable questions about, say, the function of electron torque, and maybe learn something about electrons through thinking about its functional role. That is badly put. I'll give an example in a second. But the idea is once you've got this functional unity back again, we can answer all kinds of metaphysical questions in naturalistic terms that appeal to concepts like agency and causation and so forth. So to give a quick example of this, I mentioned that Price has this view about our use of causal concepts, and he thinks that we have a causal concept so that agents can express these conditional beliefs where they're beliefs about states in the world conditional on an agent, that agent deciding freely in a certain way. And Price sort of finishes the account there in terms of thinking about, causal relations themselves. But you can, adopt aspects of Price's approach in a more quote unquote metaphysical way and take ourselves to learn something about causal relations themselves from this. Causal relations themselves are relevant to us because they track probabilistic dependencies of states of affairs in the world that we're interested in bringing about on our own free choices or actions. And I've developed this kind of account in a paper, if you're interested in seeing that sort of in more detail, that essentially you get a kind of matching up between causal relations, A is cause of B, and probabilistic relations. So if an agent deciding on A in proper deliberation for the sake of B would raise the probability of B, that is the condition that's required for a causal relation to obtain. And you get a matching up between actual causal relations and probabilities in the world. We're not just limited to talking about our concepts of causation. We learn something about causation itself. Good. So yeah, we're both learning something about causation and the way causation and probabilities match up, but also something about why we reason in causal terms. It's because these kind of probabilistic relations are incredibly relevant for agents who are in a certain sense able to make these free choices and want to bring about the effects they're interested in. Okay. Ooh. I think I can skip that as well. I think I'm going to skip this as well for the sake of time, but just to say there is a further debate to be had about the temporal direction of causation. I have an argument, which hopefully you'll see in this book you can get freely, for why Price's approach won't actually work from this. And a big part of the problem is that he's only modeling agents in causal terms. And that means that when he gives his account of why causes come before their effects, it does turn out to be viciously circular in a way that I don't think people have sort of adequately noticed in the account of the temporal asymmetry of causation. But you can actually avoid that, though, if you take yourself to be interested in causal relations from the start, and also start to model agents in non-causal terms, which is tricky, but I think doable, and does get you somewhere with explaining the temporal asymmetry of causation. Again, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but part of the book and part of what I'm doing here is thinking that you should be ultimately explaining the temporal asymmetry in naturalistic terms. And you do so partly by thinking about the function of causation and why it's relevant to us, but then also, invoking resources from typically statistical mechanics and areas of science which are aimed at explaining temporal asymmetries in general. So, focusing on agents, thinking about agents, doesn't mean that metaphysics or fundamental physics gets out of the picture. These, in fact, fit very nicely together. And thinking about the temporal asymmetry of causation is one place where you can see all these interests tying together to give a good account, I think, of the temporal asymmetry. Okay, so with my remaining few minutes, I will talk very briefly about how this may apply in the case of modal relations. Partly because I think this has been underexplored, and partly because I think it's going to be one of the sort of more novel applications of this approach. So one kind of starting point to this is that often modality, and modality of any kind, so anything that's not about the actual, but has direct implications for the possible, so including laws and causation and probabilities and generalities that have modal force. People thought these kind of modalities are in some ways inimical to naturalism. That if we're naturalists, we should be suspicious of these kind of modalities. So Hugh Price, again, and David Papineau, in thinking about naturalism, have put modality down as one of the kind of difficult cases, as difficult as things like mathematics and the mental realm and morality, in terms of fitting into a naturalistic picture of the world. And similarly, sort of naturalists who were nevertheless wanting to be sort of committed to some kind of modality in play have thought, okay, we better reduce these modal relations to some non-modal parts of actuality in order to have naturalistically respectable modal relations in play. And this is what happens with the Humean accounts that are developed by people like David Lewis and Barry Lower, where they attempt to reduce the modal to the non-modal, considering the function of things like laws and probabilities. And while I agree with the functionalism part here, I'm going to disagree with the rest of it in a second. But I think part of the motivation for these Humean programs, is that modality was considered in some sense mysterious, not naturalistically respectable. It had to be sort of reduced away to something else if, as naturalists, we were to have it in our worldview. But this has struck me now as just incredibly puzzling. Given that science is up to its necks in modal discoveries, it seems to be heavily about discovering something about the modal character of the world, be it laws or causal relations or other kind of modal generalizations or probabilities or mechanisms. This is just it strikes me as incredibly puzzling why we thought modality of, at least of the scientific kinds, was some kind of problem. Moreover, however it is where scientists are discovering these modal things, it does seem to be through naturalistic methods, be it observation or experiment or randomized controlled trials, etc. So, however it is we do come to know about the world, it does seem we do get to know about modal stuff and not just about the non-modal actual. And also, it's not just that science discovers modal stuff, it makes heavy use of this kind of modal stuff in its further discoveries. So I just want to suggest, looked at this way, I don't see why there's even a prima facie concern about the naturalistic credentials of modal relations. The starting point for a naturalist should have really been, oh, wow, of course there are these modal relations. They are sort of the bread and butter of the investigations that I take most seriously. Let us do more with them, something like that. Now, obviously that's not all that's going on. And I think, at least these days, the worry seems to be that if we look in more detail, we actually don't have a reasonable naturalistic account of how we come to know the modal. And that is, we don't have a good account of how the modal stuff relates to the actual non-modal stuff that we observe. And so we suddenly get worried about what the modal stuff is or how we have access to it at all. And I think this comes up in a bunch of places, including Van Fraasen's inference and identification problems about laws of nature, about how the laws relate to actual events, indeed in the problem of induction, about how we reason to laws based on actual non-modal stuff, and also in Lewis's complaint against certain objective accounts of probability, how they're going to get a relation between the stuff, the actual non-modal stuff we observe, and the modal relations themselves. And I think, pushed a little more, the worry is sometimes put that, if modality is distinct from the non-modal actual, that is, one does not reduce to the other in a metaphysical way, then the accounts of how the modal stuff relates to the non-modal, use the modal stuff themselves, and that looks viciously circular or like otherwise bad. So in the case of probabilities, the Humeans try to reduce probabilities to patterns in relative frequencies. Put those accounts aside, say we don't have those. The only relation there was between the probabilities and the relative frequencies was a probabilistic one, namely that it's highly probable that, over a sufficient run, the relative frequencies indicate the probabilities. And the thought is, if you're sort of explaining or justifying your modal knowledge, you can't help yourself to an account that itself uses modal relations in explaining how you could come to know the modal stuff. So people have, this comes up a lot under the label of the principle and worries about how, in general, you can tell a naturalistic story that gets your modal stuff relating to your non-modal without reducing one to the other. But I think this is just wrong. I don't think this is the right attitude to take here. And the reason being, there was never a prima facie concern about the naturalistic credentials of modal relations. They were always, heavily used as part of naturalistic methodology. So there just isn't, a straightforward naturalistic concern about using them in accounts of how we come to know the modal. It's exactly what we'd expect to use the modal relations that are found across the sciences in explaining naturalistically how we come to use modal terms. So we can say, look, it's highly probable that relative frequencies indicate the probabilities, and that's partly how we come to know what modal relations there are. And I think sort of rejecting these kind of circular approaches in this instance, I think it just comes down to giving too much weight to what turned out to be kind of non-naturalistic concerns about the mysteriousness of the modal. I know I've been a bit brief and a bit strong on these points, but I'm very happy to take counters. But this is one area, the area of modality, where I was taught to think of modality as very strange. And now that I'm kind of thinking about naturalism more generally, I just don't see how that kind of worry can get started here. It would be worry if we thought we ever only had access to non-modal stuff, but we were never in that position to begin with, essentially. Okay, finally, I think that if we do the sort of Humean thing of reducing the modal relations to the non-modal actual stuff, I think we end up with a different problem, which is we are becoming in conflict with naturalism. And I don't have time to put this argument in detail, so I'll just direct you to a different paper where this comes out. But essentially, I mentioned that Humeans were interested in functional questions about the function of modal relations. So typically, when a Humean explains how patterns in the non-modal actual are able to play the function of modal relations, they end up adopting a non-naturalistic standpoint. So, they're thinking that the probabilities, say you say the chances of a coin landing heads at a world is 0.5. The Humean says, okay, what implications does that chance claim have for what happens at that world, the actual events? The Humean says it's guaranteed that roughly half the coin tosses will come up heads in a way that takes them beyond and in conflict with probability theory. A naturalist should say that, if that's the true chance claim at a world, it's very likely that roughly half of the coin tosses will come up heads in a sufficiently long run, but by no means guaranteed. So the Humean and a kind of naturalistic view of chance have sort of different attitudes to what the chance claims imply. And that difference means that the Humeans are actually departing from the way probabilities are standardly used in scientific methodology. And this makes sense if you think that metaphysics is going beyond science, but it does not work if you think that metaphysics should just be employing scientific methodology, continually. All right, so they were my big claims. So I hope I suggested that methodological naturalism is at least a reasonable choice for doing the metaphysics of science, and that, taking this kind of approach, there can be reasonable questions to ask that go, beyond the immediate interests of ordinary domains of science. I suggested there are some substantive explanatory demands that any theory must meet, and we have to answer them naturalistically if we're being naturalists, and that answering these demands is going to require appealing to features of us, which shows how we are featuring even in doing the metaphysics of relatively fundamental physics. I hope I suggested how these kind of demands, can help make sense of and even adjudicate particular metaphysical debates about time and the direction of time, and perhaps even the metaphysics of causation. And I also hope to have at least suggested how naturalistic functionalism may lead to a much more straightforward acceptance of modal relations such as laws and causation without reducing them to non-modal things. And here are some references, and that is me done. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for this great talk. Let me remind you how we're going to be proceeding. If you have a question for Alison, please go to the bottom of your screen, click on the Q&A button, and write your name in the text box. And instead of me being the mediator, I will just promote you to panelist, and you'll be able to ask your question directly. So please go to the bottom of the screen, write your name in the text box, and then I'll be promoting you for questions. It usually takes a few seconds for that to happen. All right, so while people are doing that, let me just maybe start with a question for you to give people time to do that. And it was somehow related to, I think it's related to the discussion of price and price views about the relation between the focus on concepts and metaphysics, and the roles that pluralism plays in that area. Now you said that you think Price believes that functional pluralism extends from non-scientific domains to scientific domains, and I agree with him that if you look at scientific concepts, not necessarily philosophical concepts, you bear with me with the distinction, philosophical concepts used in science, like the concept of causation or time or agency. But if you look at scientific concepts, for example, genes, for example, species, for example, beliefs, for example, you're going to find stereotypes in psychology and so on and so forth. Psychology, evolutionary biology. Pluralism is the name of the game, right? There is no single notion of genes. There are no single notion of species. There's 26. There's no notion of innateness. There was a paper by 86 notion of innateness used in science, and so on and so on and so forth. So it just seems to be really all over the place. Isn't that a concern for you, that when you look just at scientific concepts, you just find pluralism just literally everywhere? Now, maybe time and causations are quite different in that respect, but
probably not. No, I'm all into the pluralism, and I guess there's pluralism of two types here. I mean, one is within a single concept, single word, say, yes, a bunch of different concepts or a bunch of subtly distinct functions that they're playing. And then also, across different sciences, they might be doing quite different things as well. So I want to, I know this was done very quickly. I want to agree with all the functional pluralism that Price has in mind, but I just don't think it has the upshot that he thinks it does. So the way it would work in his case is something like, say I'm wondering, how we come to use the term agency in this kind of very computer science, sense of agency or something. Price would say, it's somehow illicit or kind of, I can't learn anything about this computer science, the actual property of being an agent in a computer sciencey sense from thinking about why people have reasoned in this way. And the reason is, we can't, me adopting my perspective of being, he sometimes calls them, the philosophical anthropologist, investigating why we use the terms we do, I just can't help myself to thinking that there are these kind of, computer science agents in the world. That would be somehow wrong. And, my small way of saying why that doesn't work, first of all, Price applies it to causation. And it can't possibly be true that, it's somehow illicit to use causal talk when being a philosophical anthropologist. Definitely I'm using causal relations. I'm committed to there being those things. But secondly, it's possible something's gone wrong, with a given concept. It's possible that thing doesn't in fact refer. But assuming that it does, I do think there is at least this kind of derivational thing in play. So, say you're using two different concepts of agency and they have different implications for what will happen in the world, at a certain point, that's going to become a problem. If you apply them to the same given case, and one of them has different implications from the other, measurably different implications, eventually the world is going to tell us that at least one of those is either mistaken or was applied outside its proper domain, something like that. So the thought is, it would be a different game if sciences were operating in sort of such distinct domains, they didn't have to talk to one another, but they really do. And the sort of ultimate test is when we kind of look at the actual world where that concept applies and kind of check what happens. So yeah, functional pluralism definitely, but it doesn't mean that we can't use those concepts or learn about the world from thinking about why we actually use those concepts. That will actually tell us something about genes in any of these senses, assuming there are such things. Oh, you're muted, sorry.
I muted myself. Let me push back just a tiny little bit. I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. But take, for example, a concept like species, and it's true. So you have many different concepts of species. I think it's widely agreed by evolutionary biologists. They're fully aware of that. There's no, there's not too much confusions about the matter. Nowadays, it's actually pretty clear. The same is true for genes. And so it's a situation where they clearly do refer to different things. That, they're partitioning the world in slightly different groups. What's a species for one concept is not quite a species for the other, and so on and so on and so forth. But somehow it seems to be deflationary very much. So you've got these things that it's not totally unrelated. They're very related for one another. And if you don't pay attention to the situation, you can get into indeed troubles with your thinking carefully. You can do inferences that are illicit, indeed the way you describe it. But if you're careful, you're not going to do that. But then there's a lot of these debates about what's a species and what should we care about, whether something is a species. That's really just become totally trivial. There's just 26 different types of groups out there. And I think the same is true of causation. There's these 26 different relations between events, and actually there's some relations which are not between events, they're actually facts. And it just seems totally deflationary once you agree of this great plurality in the texture of the world that follows from the plurality of concepts. Maybe that's not a worry for you.
It's not, but I can see why you might think it was. So I guess there's deflationary in maybe two different senses here. Yeah. One is this metaphysical deflationary, where once we've acknowledged that there's different, there's 86 different concepts we could have meant, and none of them is like the privileged one, and they're all just kind of different things we could mean. You could think that we're somehow stuck just talking about different concepts, and we sort of stop latching onto the world. That's a very kind of strong sort of deflationism. Then there's a deflationary more in the sense of, there aren't natural kinds. There is no privileged way of carving up the world. that stuff I'm so on board with. And indeed, I used to not label this project metaphysics because I think metaphysics does have these implications of there being, a privileged carving, and that as soon as you admit, fine distinctions and lots of different ways we could have done things, you're somehow not really discovering the true metaphysical nature that you wanted. My attitude is fine. There was never that to begin with. I'm just interested in, what are the concepts we're actually using and what are the kinds of things they're picking out, even if they're not privileged in any of those senses, and even if it's maybe very contingent in some cases, what we're using and for what purposes. So yeah, all to my mind, grist to my mill, which is to say, yeah, this seems great to me, but yeah, not what everyone wanted, but it's enough for what I wanted.
Totally great. All right, Siddharth, floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so very interesting talk. So I wanted to ask you a question about some of the stuff that you covered in the last part of your talk about modality and your suggestion that when we do science, we do have modal knowledge, we use modal concepts all the time, and we use our scientific theories to make, we think that we have modal knowledge as a consequence of them. So I wanted to ask you about sort of what precisely you mean by that, because clearly, quantum field theories are not written in the language of modal logic, right? It's not that strong that our scientific theories are shot through with modal language. It's more that when we actually interpret and use the theories, we seem to use them as a secure basis for modal knowledge. And the most secure basis is usually those cases in which where we actually test the theory in some domain, and there it collapses from modal knowledge to just knowledge about the future, right? So I guess, how exactly do you take that modal knowledge to be embedded in our theories or practice, or some combinations thereof? Thanks.
I probably won't say enough to satisfy you, and please feel free to push back on this. But I want to identify it in the, if you don't want to say it's part of the theory, part of the theoretical interpretation we give on theories that involve us in claims about laws, causation, probabilities, mechanisms, modal generalizations. So I'm sort of, my more familiar science is physics, and there we have laws, and they're designed to get us from something like initial conditions or states at a given time to states at other times. And it's true that when we test them, it's typically because we're making something actual, and so they are just having implications for the actual. But they had those implications even before we made them actual. We were testing a claim it was already making about what relations held between different things. Even though it's sort of, I think, easier maybe in the case of things like probability distributions and laws in physics, or relatively fundamental physics. Same with causal relations and so forth. I take it those have implications that go beyond what we actually observe, and that concern, so for example, you might think about combining two different causal mechanisms together, and you think that your theories have implications for what will happen there. Again, and they have those implications even before you make any of them actual. So yeah, I don't have a developed view on the content of scientific theories and sort of how much of this is kind of interpretation added to the theory and with what license. But I mean, maybe put otherwise, the kind of worries that people had with modality were meant to apply to core across all these kinds of relations. And they took those worries very seriously and, had to reduce all these relations to other things. So yeah, provided, if we're on board with helping ourselves to these relations in some sense that goes beyond what people were happy with, that's all I want to get from my science, basically. The sort of, what I'm going to call, like, not non-reflective use of these concepts, but something like, yeah, I can talk about these theories in these ways, without having to give a reduction of these modal relations to non-modal stuff.
Do I have time for a quick follow-up, Eduard?
You do, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think the last part that you said is the thing that sort of I'm most unsure about, is whether, so I agree that, you know, in practice, you certainly take yourself to have modal knowledge when you're employing these theories. I think that's very difficult to argue against. However, to go the further step that need not be or cannot be, I don't think you're making the stronger claim that it cannot be, but it need not be reduced to non-modal notions. That I don't necessarily see as something internal to scientific practice itself. Or at the very least, I would have to sort of think through better why that would be. If that makes sense.
No, sorry, I think I agree with you. Yeah, no, I don't think you get out of scientific practice that these things are not reduced. It's a sort of two-step argument. The first claim is you at least get to have them and use them. You know, they're sort of part of your theoretical apparatus. And maybe you're not sure what they are, maybe you're not sure sort of where they reduce or not, but you just get to have them. And that plays a role because most of the arguments in favor of reduction relied on the claim that you just couldn't have those until you reduce them. So basically this defeats an argument against the primitivism. It doesn't say you have to be a primitivist. Yeah, the argument against the reduction kind of came very, very quickly on a single slide in the last closing minutes. But, you know, imagine kind of someone like David Lewis arguing that laws play the role of best systematizing. When he takes up that perspective, he's no longer thinking about the laws as things that, you know, modally govern, or like that the implications of the laws aren't the ones that a scientist would expect them to have. You know, the laws start having quite different implications. You know, sometimes he means like law is quite explicit sometimes that in explaining the function of laws, he takes up the kind of metaphysical explanatory stuff that's distinct from scientific explanation. So sometimes they're even, you know, helping themselves to like a kind of non-naturalistic view there. So that's where the complaint about reduction comes in. It's sort of a deeper level.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thanks.
Bruce, floor is yours. Unmute yourself.
Hello. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk, and I do foundations of physics, and so I guess I'm probably going to sound a bit naive because I have been really laser focused on, you know, specific physical theories, and I haven't thought too much, you know, about the kinds of more meta considerations that you're dealing with here. I think very, very well and very incisively. And I guess one thing I would observe just as a general issue here is that the whole idea that naturalism has this kind of normative weight to it, and that is sort of, if you're not conforming to naturalism, then that you're not right thinking. And that an aspect of this, again, that goes to, well, how do we define naturalism? But I won't worry about that for now. So the issue of the modality, the sort of suspicion around the concept of modality, I think arises because of the general, you know, empiricist demands on physics. Clearly, when we're doing physics, we've got to be empirically responsible, and we can't go off. We're not doing metaphysics, we're doing physics. But I think that leads to an implicit prejudice towards actualism. I mean, that's, I think, what makes physicists suspicious of these modal concepts. And I think it's maybe helpful to get some sense of, you know, why are we so stuck on actualism? Oh, well, it's because physics is empirically responsible. So we observe actual things, clearly. So when that kind of puts us in this difficult position of, as physicists, how do we be, you know, fair about the modal concept? And I guess what I always go back to is the fact that quantum theory, that when we're dealing with modal, issues, we're not doing it in a sense of, well, you know, it's not necessarily tied to frequencies and to inferring that frequencies must conform to probabilities and so on. It's actually just something that got handed to us through quantum theory. Nobody ordered it, right? We got the Born rule, and Born was like, well, I don't know, I guess you square this thing, whatever this thing is, it seems to work. I guess you have to square it. And, you know, it's like nobody wanted it, but the theory itself kind of thrust it upon us. So I guess my observation is, you know, suppose there were ontological possibles in the world. Suppose there were, I mean, maybe that's crazy, but suppose there were, and our classical theories failed because we didn't know about them. How would they rear their ugly heads? They would do quantum theory, and that they would thrust themselves upon us. So that's kind of the way I think of it, that, you know, no, of course, as good empiricists, you know, everything should be actual. What's this modal nonsense? Well, if there are or were, you know, you don't have to buy into it. I mean, I happen to, but you don't have to agree. Nobody has to agree with me. But if there were these real entities in the world that functioned as modal entities, that's how they would, you know, force themselves upon us. So that's just, you know, maybe just a comment that it's sort of another way, I think, for physics to deal with this modal notion, and not as, well, it's useful and it's about us and about the way we want to describe and the way we want to predict and so on. But it's actually kind of just, you know, came at us, you know, when Heisenberg went off to his island and said, oh my God, you know, what's going on here? I've got these laundry lists. What on earth are these things? So that's, you know, I think that could be useful going forward to kind of, you know, decriminalize, if you will, you know, modal relations, that, well, maybe the theory's actually just describing these entities. And so that's another tool, a conceptual tool, as a way to kind of, you know, get a grip on the idea that modality need not be something that we should run away from. So just along, you know, whatever, I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
That's helpful and fun. And like, there's a helpful reminder to begin with, that just like, I do know about empiricism and I sort of forget that I do, but, you know, that is where a lot of this comes from, of course. And I haven't done like the historical work either, but I suspect a lot of this also comes from thinking about perception, you know, thinking about what we perceive is the non-modal actual, and therefore our access epistemically more generally to the actual stuff is limited to the non-modal.
Right.
You know, so, but it's nice if I can sort of tell a bit of a story about that as well. I guess I have a few more things to say on the rest of it. I mean, I didn't make a big point of this in the talk, but yeah, you know, saying that our knowledge is limited to the actual does not imply that it's limited to the non-modal. You know, you might think there are modal parts of reality, and indeed that's the sort of view I have. So there has been, I think, this tendency to kind of equate sort of actualism with, you know, what we have access to is the non-modal. And indeed, I mean, I didn't get into this, but like a lot of the complaints about modality were actually complaints about things like Lewis's modal realism, where you genuinely did have these other possible worlds out there that were spatio-temporally distinct and so forth. You know, so, but yeah, the kind of modality I'm interested in is sort of actual modality, you know, things that are actually actually present in some sense. Yeah, with the quantum mechanics stuff, you know, we could have a big fun discussion about, you know, what to say about interpretations of quantum mechanics. I have been thinking about it because with respect to this project, at least, I think you can say interesting things about, for example, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics using this kind of approach, where, you know, when I do particular debates using this method, what I'm usually starting with is something like, what is the function of this stuff? You know, can we learn something about what this stuff is like, or how it relates to other things by considering this function? And I think it is clear that in some sense, our thinking about probability and its function got much more complex when it came to the case of quantum mechanics. And there are, you know, some proposals to think of probability as being quite a different thing from what we thought it was like. And I think, a helpful way of evaluating those kind of proposals is to think about, how much do they depart from the function that we thought probability had, and do they answer the kind of explanatory demands that we wanted met? Sorry, this is probably unhelpful for me to say this, but in the case of many worlds, I think it's a kind of glass half full, in that it's not ruled out as a possibility, which some people do, but there are some costs involved. So the way probability will guide future action, for example, I think has to be revised substantially in ways that not everyone is on board with.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, it is definitely like a fun case study, and I think it does, in a way, it starts to problematize, even how we think of the distinctions between the non-modal and the modal in these kind of cases.
Right. Yes.
So yeah, this is all very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth, for joining us. We have literally a couple of minutes left, so if someone has an urgent question, I can rush you in.
I can follow up.
Please, if you want to follow up, as I said, we have.
If there's no one.
Go for it, Ruth.
Yeah. So I happen to be a critic of the many worlds approach, and I don't know if you're familiar with my work, but I've been doing working with the transactional interpretation. So that does have a and there are different ways of viewing that as well. But in the way I've developed it, it does involve ontologically real form of modality of the different possible outcomes for a measurement, in a sense, do have a physical ontological reality, in a sense. So then measurement is defined in a certain way so that you get an actual out of it. So that's kind of where I'm thinking that, and that's one interpretation or one formulation that certainly, I'm not going to say it's the only right way, but it's clearly a way that I've been interested in and been working with. And it's just a different way. I mean, even apart from that, I always go back to Heisenberg, and I'm thinking how, that we need to distinguish between discovery, theoretical discovery, and theory construction, and the testing and confirmation and corroboration of theories. And I think that often the concern about naturalism is tied in with, confirming theories, corroborating theories, and using theories. Whereas many times theory discovery is a very haphazard kind of, almost creative endeavor. And it could sound Platonist and sort of naively, idealistic perhaps, but that sometimes people just kind of stumble on something that works, right? And it's, well, Boltzmann was, considering atoms, and they were empirically suspect. Yeah, obviously, if you go in the history of that they were really, he had a lot of problems because that was considered irresponsible. So I just think sometimes it can be useful to look at theory discovery as another way of, as a legitimate aspect of science, and arguably that doesn't fit as comfortably into the usual kinds of, naturalistic considerations, such as what are we using it for? How are we going to talk about it? Because it's kind of a different process, if you will.
And this is helpful, actually, because
Modally.
So some people have talked about naturalism in a sense of, we make only small changes to our theories as required. And, I'm also interested in pragmatism, as is probably clear, but, sometimes that was also thought of in terms of, no big changes to our theories, kind of like small adjustments as, but I don't have very settled views actually on how, whether there are reasonable bounds to theoretical discovery, whether we should rule out some things. Weirdly, all the work that my naturalism does is pretty much at the confirmation stage. It's pretty much, or even later in some sense, saying, given your theory is up and running, is it now doing the things that it's needed to do? And because it allows for like essentially circularity, you're using the theory to explain how the theory can do the things it needs to do, it's in fact much more amenable to large-scale theoretical changes than other sort of naturalist or pragmatist approaches have been sometimes. And that can be a bad thing for me sometimes, because I don't like Magdalen's views about the direction of time, and yet I can't say he's failing to be naturalistic because he's kind of revising science. I mean, maybe sometimes science needs to be revised. So it actually, it's a true and interesting thing that I think the naturalism, for me, has the bite at the confirmation stage rather than at the discovery stage. But I know there was a talk that Nina Memory gave many years ago talking about something quite different, but I think the kind of explanatory demands I put in place are enough to get you out of certain kind of skeptical scenarios that you don't want to be in.
Sure.
And that means that you can be much more open-minded at the discovery stage, because you're not worried about having to exclude those kind of skeptical things. They'll get cut out later.
Right.
So there might be some advantage to this, but it's probably a cost balance thing, and it is interesting the way they pull apart.
All right, and we'll stop on these words. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks for this great talk, Alison. It's really been wonderful as usual to listen to you. And we are looking forward to the book as well. So hopefully within a few weeks, if not within a few months, but we are all very impatient to read it. All right, and we'll see you either in person or on Zoom on Friday at 3:30, and next week for the last week of talks. All right, bye guys.
Thanks very much again for having me.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.